Hans Holbein was undoubtedly our window into the court of King Henry VIII. His remarkable portrait collection allows us to see who the figures of the Tudor court were, from Henry VIII himself to his wives, his political enemies, lawyers, churchmen, and much more. There was also Holbein's remarkable metalwork collections and the sets he designed for state occasions, including the coronation of Anne Boleyn. To discuss this remarkable man with me, I am pleased to welcome back Dr Elizabeth Goldring onto the podcast for a discussion based around her upcoming book, Holbein, Renaissance Master. From Holbein's early life to the methods he used to symbolism in his imagery, all will be discussed. So settle in as Elizabeth and I explore the life of the 16th century's greatest artist. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 111, Holbein, Renaissance Master, with Dr Elizabeth Goldring. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Elizabeth Goldring. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me back, Adam.
Yes, and this is your first time solo. You're normally joined by your sidekick.
Oh, you're right. That's absolutely right. Yes, indeed. So fingers crossed I can do it without Emma.
Yes, I'm sure you'll be absolutely fine. You're here to talk about your latest book, Holbein, Renaissance Master. It's a beautiful book. I mean, it's obviously chock-a-block full of Holbein's amazing art, but also his story and the story of the Holbeins more broadly. So I'm really looking forward to getting into the conversation with you. You've been on the podcast a couple of times, so I've sort of amended the opening questions a bit because I'm sure people now know who you are and what you do. So with that in mind, sort of some more fanciful questions around Holbein. So if you had the chance to ask Hans Holbein a single question, what would it be?
Oh, gosh. There are a lot of questions I would like to ask him, but if I could only ask one, I think it would be, where were you buried? Where are you buried? We know that he died in London in the autumn of 1543, and it's generally assumed that he died of the plague. There was a plague epidemic at the time. But because of the epidemic, obviously, graveyards were filling up rapidly, and there were issues about needing to contain the spread of the disease. So a lot of bodies ended up dumped in plague pits. So we don't really know where Holbein's final resting place was and is, and it would be nice to know that. But I suspect that's one of those questions we will never get an answer to.
Sadly not. Which of the many unidentified sketches and portraits by Holbein would you love to know the true identity of?
Another good question, and another one where I potentially would like to know the identities of an awful lot of the unidentified sitters. But I think if I could only choose one, there's for me, very interesting, very enigmatic portrait of a woman in the Royal Collection, which, based on the type of paper that it is that Holbein used, we can date to his first visit to England, so 1526 to 1528. And it's clear from the woman's dress, from her clothing, that she is not from the courtly milieu that most of Holbein's sitters were. She looks to be more, from what we might call the middling sort, or the, possibly from the sort of artisanal craftsman classes. And what's really interesting to me about this image is that there's a kind of immediacy and intimacy to it that you don't get in most of Holbein's portraits. The woman has a slightly suppressed grin in the portrait. Her cheeks are flushed. One slightly wonders, was this a woman who was in some way special to Holbein? We know he had quite complicated domestic arrangements. By the end of his life, he had two families on the go, one in England, one in Basel. We don't know if he was a bigamist. We don't know if he was married to two women at the same time, but he certainly had two ladies and two sets of children that he was sort of juggling. So it would be interesting to know more about this unidentified woman in this drawing in the Royal Collection from the mid-1520s.
Lovely. And which of the recorded, so we know they were done, but lost pieces of Holbein's work would you love to uncover?
Gosh, another great question. I think I think it would be very exciting to actually be able to see in the flesh any of the work that he did for court festivals. We know that he was very much in demand as a painter of ephemeral art and architecture. And obviously, there's a clue in the name, ephemeral. It wasn't designed to last. It was meant to be disposed of like a stage prop, really. But it would be so exciting to be able to see, for example, the celestial ceiling that he painted as a roof for a temporary theatre at Greenwich Palace in 1527, or a painting of the Battle of the Spurs that he painted also for the 1527 Greenwich Revels. We have a lot of written descriptions of these, but it would be really, really exciting if by chance something like that had survived.
Yeah, those things, I always think about those things that you had at major court ceremonies. One of the things I would love to see, and it's not a Holbein, but I'm sure you're aware that at the coronation procession of Elizabeth I, there was a three-tiered creation that showed Henry VII and Elizabeth of York.
Yes, yes.
I'd love to have seen that.
Absolutely. I mean, court festivals were such an important part of the visual culture of this time period, and so much money was lavished on these events that sometimes just lasted a few hours. And the leading artists of the day routinely were called upon to produce work, but so frustrating now that we have to rely on written sources and our imaginations in the main to try to figure out what these dazzling court festivals must have looked like.
So, as I said at the start, you're here to talk about your most recent book. Well, it's not out just yet, is it? I think a few more days.
November 11th in the UK, not until January 6th in the US.
Okay, but it's Holbein Renaissance Master. I mean, it's a beautiful book. It's kind of like a coffee table book. It's quite big. This obviously is full of imagery. How long have you been working on it?
Well, I started working on it in earnest in 2019, right after I finished my book on Nicholas Hilliard. And I've been working on it ever since. It's been my main project since 2019. But in some ways, I think Holbein has been at the back of my mind since the start of my career. My first art history publication, which was way back in 2002, was a short article in the Burlington magazine about Holbein's Christina of Denmark. And in various ways, Holbein has kind of been hovering at the back of my mind ever since. So writing this book, writing Holbein Renaissance Master, has been a real joy, and I guess what you would call a full circle moment. It's fun to come back to the artists that I started with.
And you start by exploring the lives of the Holbein family. I wasn't aware that Hans's full name was actually Johannes, I'm assuming is the pronunciation. He went by Hans. Where were the family based to start with, and was art a major part of the Holbein family identity?
They were based in Augsburg, which is obviously now part of Germany, but was at the time part of the Holy Roman Empire. And art was absolutely central to their lives. Holbein's father was a sacred painter in Augsburg, and in the 1490s and early 1510s, one of the leading sacred painters in Augsburg. His fortunes went into decline from about 1510 onwards. But for a good 20 years, he was one of the top 2 or 3 painters in Augsburg, and in demand not just in the city, but actually throughout the German-speaking land. So we know from documentary sources that the family would periodically up sticks to travel to Frankfurt or Alsace or wherever Holbein the Elder happened to have a juicy commission. So art would have been absolutely central to the young Holbein's youth. And his father's workshop was staffed with various distant relatives, as well as individuals who were not connected by blood or marriage to the family at all. But there was this wide network of artists and craftsmen that would have been very much part of his day-to-day life as a child in Augsburg and on the road.
So did Hans Holbein the Younger train under his father? I mean, did his father teach him his craft?
I think that that must have been what happened. We don't know for sure what form Holbein's early training and early education took. But I think the assumption has to be that both he and his elder brother, who was called Ambrosius, would have had their initial training in draftsmanship and painting from their father. Probably the assumption on their father's part would have been that these two boys would grow up to one day work alongside him in the Augsburg workshop and potentially in due course take it over and run it themselves. As events transpired, that did not happen. As I mentioned, Holbein the Elder's fortunes went into decline in about 1510, and his sons ended up leaving Augsburg a few years thereafter and eventually settling in Basel. But I think their early training must have been at their father's side, observing him and other members of the workshop, probably helping out from time to time. As I mentioned, their father was a sacred painter, and it would have been standard practice for apprentices to cut their teeth in a workshop by eventually being allowed to sort of help out with background details in, sort of crowd scenes or what have you in sacred paintings. So, there may well be bits and bobs in Holbein the Elder's large sacred paintings that were executed by his young sons.
And can I ask you more broadly about the evolution of portraiture at this time? And in particular, I suppose, where the change in quality comes from? Because where is the knowledge gap? Because when we look at portraiture of the medieval period, I mean, if we go back to the 10th, 11th, 12th century, the drawings of kings and queens look like they've been done by a blind 5-year-old. Then we get to Hans Holbein, surely people didn't just suddenly become good at drawing. So what was driving this, if that makes sense? Where was that leap in quality?
That's a really good question, a really big question. We could devote, I think, a whole podcast to trying to unravel that. But I think the short answer, which necessarily slightly oversimplifies things, but I think the short answer is that there's almost a perfect storm of conditions in the early 16th century. So you've got the rise of humanism, you've got the Reformation, both of which place greater emphasis on the individual, on the self, and there's sort of a new interest, a new introspection, a new interest in examining the self. And then meanwhile, there are developments in artistic techniques and materials that are probably conducive to the rise of portraiture. So there's a movement away from painting in egg tempera to oils, which possibly makes it easier to create what we might see as lifelike, realistic images. So there's kind of this whole combination of elements that by chance come together in the early 16th century and I think contribute to the rise of portraiture.
Because it's surprising, isn't it? Because as much as I could be wrong, but I'm fairly certain that all of the Edward IV's, Richard III's, all of those portraits were not contemporary. Elizabeth Woodville, none of them are actually contemporary. But we do know, because it's on display at Westminster Abbey, that there was that full length of Richard II. Now, while it's not, I suppose, as the quality isn't Holbein level, it's still a very good image it gives us a good indication of what Richard II looked like. So I suppose it's quite surprising, really, that his successors, Henry IV and Henry V, etc., didn't say, "Oh, I want one of those," that didn't happen.
Yes, it's interesting, but I think for a long time, it's important to remember that for a long time, telegraphing identity and status and rank was often done through heraldry, through coats of arms. It wouldn't necessarily have occurred to a medieval or early modern person really prior to the 1520s, 1530s, when Holbein starts to sort of shake up the status quo in England, to communicate their rank, their status, who they were through anything other than heraldry. Yeah.
And I think because the Tudors were the first PR-driven monarchs in many respects. So it makes sense that they would commission portraiture in the way that they do, because this was a reign with a big PR arm behind it, even if the term didn't exist at the time.
Exactly. But I think it's one of the things I found interesting when researching and writing this book is that it's a gradual process. I think that when Holbein first arrives in England in 1526, Henry VIII is not at that stage hugely interested in painted portraiture. If he wants to splash out to show his magnificence, it's court festivals, it's architectural commissions, it's jewelry, it's gold and silver plate. And then a decade later, it's as if the penny drops and he suddenly, in the mid-1530s, realizes that with an artist like Holbein, actually painted portraiture can be a fantastic means of communicating your magnificence, and it's portable and you can send portraits of yourself all over, and it's a great PR tool. But it's very interesting to see this shift in Henry VIII's attitudes towards painting and portraiture.
And an area of Hans Holbein's craft that I was wholly unaware of until reading your book was wall art, some examples of which survive in Basel. So what were these, and are there any examples in Britain that survive?
Yes, it's really interesting. Wall paintings were ubiquitous in early 16th century Basel and indeed throughout the German-speaking lands. And we're talking both internal walls and external walls. For obvious reasons, there aren't many surviving examples. Obviously, internal walls would have been at the mercy of greasy handprints, soot. External walls, obviously, at the mercy of rain, snow, sleet, sun, etc. So again, we very much have to use our imagination to try to figure out what these walls might have looked like. But in Basel, we know that Holbein painted the interior walls of the great council chamber in what was basically Basel's town hall, and he decorated these walls with scenes of good governance from antiquity, so obviously designed to inspire the councillors as they were deliberating. And we can get a pretty good sense of what those interior walls would have looked like from a combination of some surviving drawings by Holbein, designs, and then some fragments of the actual wall paintings which were salvaged in the early 19th century, but they really are just fragments. And in some cases, they had been overpainted in the intervening centuries. So you do have to use your imagination. And we also have an excellent example, again, from Basel of external wall painting in the Haus zum Tanz, which was the mansion of a very wealthy local goldsmith, which was on one of the main thoroughfares through Basel. And Holbein was hired to paint the exterior, which we only know about the appearance of from written descriptions and from some copies of Holbein's designs, but we know that it was decorated with apparently dazzling displays of trompe-l'oeil, including a depiction of Marcus Curtius on horseback, poised as if to leap into the street below. And this was a huge talking point in Basel and a tourist attraction well into the late 16th century. It was clearly something that people came to Basel to see. In terms of whether Holbein did any similar wall painting in England, I assume he must have done. External wall painting wasn't such a thing in Tudor England, but internal wall painting was ubiquitous in all sorts of buildings in Tudor England. Again, we just don't really have surviving examples, but I think the assumption would have to be that Holbein would have been called upon to do that. He obviously had lots of experience doing it from his time in Basel, and it would have been a very natural thing for patrons in England to have asked him to do, to paint internal walls.
So it's effectively, you know, we still have examples of, in palaces, beautifully painted ceilings. This was effectively the same thing, but on the walls, basically.
Exactly. And so much cheaper than tapestry. Not everyone could afford tapestry.
Yeah, well, I think the tapestries at Hampton Court Palace were worth more than Hampton Court Palace. Like, there's some mad statistic that what Henry paid for them was more than the cost of a palace. That
would not surprise me. I mean, tapestries were by far the most expensive form of visual display, or the most expensive thing you could hang on your walls, I should say. Yes, just vastly outstripped the amounts anyone was paying for paintings, whether freestanding paintings to hang on the wall or just painted walls.
So Holbein came to the attention of the great European scholar Desiderius Erasmus. How did they come to meet? And could you argue that Erasmus is effectively Holbein's first big client?
So Holbein and Erasmus meet in Basel. I mentioned that Holbein and his brother leave Augsburg at some point between about 1512 probably and 1515, after their father's fortunes go into what seems to have been terminal decline. And they end up in Basel. We don't know if the Holbeins set out with the intention of going to Basel or if they just ended up there by chance. But by late 1515, they seem to have put down roots in Basel, the two brothers. And by chance, Erasmus also has recently arrived in Basel from England, where he had been living for many, many years. And Holbein and Erasmus are both very much in the orbit of Johannes Froben, who was one of Basel's leading printers. And Basel itself, I should perhaps pause to note, was at this date one of the leading print centers north of the Alps. It was for the purpose of working with Froben that Erasmus had left England to go to Basel. He wanted to have Froben print new editions of many of his existing works and wanted Froben also to be his sort of go-to printer for any future works. And Holbein, by 1516, was designing title pages for Froben. So it was clearly through Froben that they first met. We don't know anything about their actual first meeting, but it must have been through the Froben press that they first crossed paths and that Holbein first came to Erasmus's attention. But it's not until 1523 that Erasmus commissions a portrait from Holbein. And this really only comes about because Dürer, from whom Erasmus first had commissioned a portrait, lets him down and is just taking far too long with the commission. And Erasmus eventually gets fed up and turns to Holbein. So Holbein is still pretty young at this stage, and it's a great break, and it really does make his career. Prior to this 1523 commission from Erasmus, Holbein was very well known in Basel and the surrounding German-speaking lands, but he wasn't possessed of a wider pan-European reputation. But what Erasmus wanted was portraits of himself that he could send to all his humanist friends throughout Europe, send to monarchs like Francis I, King of France, with whom he was hoping to ingratiate himself. So Holbein's fame quickly spread thanks to these commissions from Erasmus. Holbein ended up creating two portrait types for Erasmus, which could then be replicated and tweaked, sometimes to suit the identity of a given recipient, and to, the props, for example, could be tweaked to reflect the nature of the recipient's relationship with Erasmus. But anyway, from 1523 onwards, these images start making their way across Europe, and Holbein's reputation suddenly starts to expand beyond Basel, far beyond Basel. So undoubtedly, Erasmus, as to answer your question or your second question, was Holbein's first big client. He is the one who really makes Holbein's reputation for him.
And he also then obviously goes on to introduce Holbein's work to Thomas More, who becomes his first English patron. So at what point does Hans Holbein arrive in England, and how did he spend those first months? I mean, I think he literally moved in with Thomas More's family, right?
Well, Holbein arrives in England in late 1526, probably November, maybe early December. He's carrying a letter of recommendation to More from Erasmus. That letter does not survive, but More's response does. And so we can see that he promises that he will do all he can to help Holbein. We know that many previous protégés of Erasmus who had been sent to England with letters for More had been offered room and board in the More household. Presumably, More offered Holbein the same. We don't know if Holbein ended up living with More for the duration of his first visit to England, which ended up being about 18 months. It's often assumed that he did. We don't actually know that for sure. I suspect there may have been points when it would have been more convenient for Holbein to have been based in the City of London rather than in Chelsea, which was where More was at this date based. But undoubtedly, More's estate in Chelsea is the place that Holbein must have spent a huge amount of time, must have been very familiar with. And certainly, I think for that first month or two while he was finding his feet, would have been living there. And quite possibly he did live there for the whole time. We just don't know. But he certainly seems to do a huge amount of work for More. I think it's no exaggeration to say that most of the commissions that Holbein received during this first visit to England stemmed either directly or indirectly from More's patronage. So he ends up painting portraits of More and More's family. He, through More, gets the commission to do the 1520 or some painting for the 1527 Greenwich Revels. Those revels took place in May 1527, but we know that preparations got underway in about January of 1527. So presumably Holbein, within weeks of his arrival, was plunging headfirst not only into commissions for More himself, but also the work he was doing for the Greenwich Revels.
And Holbein's portrait of Sir Thomas More is easily one of his most famous works. It's instantly recognisable. The original is, well, there's one housed in New York, which is the one we see regularly, and then there is a near identical one in Crosby Manor Hall. Can we talk about the significance of this portrait in particular? Because do you think it is what kick-started the trend of courtiers wanting their images to be taken?
I think it is. That was one of the really exciting discoveries in the course of writing this book, that, as I mentioned, we know that More, from the letter he writes responding to Erasmus's letter of introduction, says that he'll do his best for Holbein. And in digging further into the documentary record, it became very apparent that More must have ordered multiple versions of his portrait from Holbein to give to family members, to give to fellow courtiers, to give to humanist friends. I mean, surely, for example, he must have sent one to Erasmus. And very few of those survive today, I think for obvious reasons. After More's downfall, a lot of people might have thought it was shrewd to throw those paintings on the fire and disavow any previous ties to More. But I think what's very clear from the documentary evidence is that More is circulating images of himself to other members of Erasmus's circle at the Tudor court and further afield on the continent. And then that inspires other members of this circle, people like William Warham, Archbishop of Canterbury, Sir Henry Guilford, and others, to commission portraits of themselves. And they're all exchanging portraits, hanging them on their walls, often as friendship diptychs. So More's portrait, for example, if displayed next to one of the images of Erasmus that Holbein had created in 1523, makes a lovely friendship diptych. The two men pivoted towards each other as if mid-scholarly colloquy. And so I think there were a lot of displays like that within humanist circles. But the genius of the template that Holbein created for More is that it was very flexible. So the portrait that we all know from the Frick could be, as I've just mentioned, displayed as one half of a friendship diptych with another humanist like Erasmus, but it would also work as one half of a marital diptych displayed alongside one of Lady More. There is an example of a freestanding portrait of her that survives. It's not actually by Holbein's own hand, it's by his Basel workshop, but gives a sense of what images of her by Holbein's own hand must have looked like. So I think that's really one of the very clever things that Holbein does. He devises templates for people that are very flexible, and the templates can be tweaked, so the props can be altered, the precise appearance of the painting can be altered depending on the recipient. So, for example, if More did send an example of Holbein's portrait of him to Erasmus, I suspect he might not have wanted to be depicted with his gold chain of S's in it. Erasmus had often spoken and written approvingly of More being someone who disdained to wear such such things as gold chains unless absolutely forced to do so. So I think that there may have been some tweaking of the basic template, depending on the intended recipient. And then obviously different recipients could display the image, slightly differently depending on whether it was going to be part of a friendship diptych, part of a marital diptych, etc. So it's really very clever. And when you start looking at inventories and other documents illustrative of display practices in England in the early 16th century, you can start to chart from the 1520s onwards a growth in the display of portraits that really maps very closely onto the timing of Holbein's arrival in England. And it's really, really exciting.
And you also include in the book some examples of sketches of Thomas More that are preparatory sketches that are done ahead of obviously creating a fully realised portrait, with one of the sketches having a clear pricking process. So what was this and how was it used?
Exactly. So Holbein's practice was to draw his sitters from the life and on paper, and then the paper image would need to be, or its outlines would need to be transferred at some stage to a wooden panel. And there were various means by which that transfer could be achieved. But one of these was called pricking and pouncing, which basically involved making tiny holes, pinpricks basically, around the outlines of the drawing so that chalk or charcoal dust, known as pouncing powder, could be sieved through onto the wooden panel, creating an outline basically. So then you're kind of connecting the dots on the wooden panel. And as you rightly say, one of Holbein's drawings of More, which is now in the Royal Collection, still has visibly these pinpricks around the outline of More's figure. What's curious is that not very many of Holbein's surviving drawings show evidence of pricking. So we don't know, is that just a quirk of what has and has not happened to survive? Or did he more often use tracing perhaps as a means of transfer? That was another option. As to why this particular drawing of More was pricked for transfer, pricking did help to streamline production. So if, as we were discussing a moment ago, More was ordering large numbers of copies and variations of this basic template, pricking would perhaps have helped to speed along the process and helped Holbein to produce, meet the demand for copies and variations. But we don't know exactly why this particular drawing is pricked for transfer when so many are not.
It almost sounds like it's a sort of much more elaborate, much more grown-up version of, like painting by numbers that you do when you're a kid.
Yes, absolutely. That's the perfect way of putting it. I mean, it's obviously more sophisticated than that, as you say, but it's that same basic concept. Yeah. Indeed.
So another early commission for Holbein, and based on what you said a moment ago, this could have been a wedding diptych, but it's the double portraits of Henry and Margaret Guildford. And what I really love about this portrait, and I didn't realise it until I went to the Holbein exhibition at Buckingham Palace a couple of years ago, but there is a clear curtain rail that runs along the top of the two images that, if you put them side by side, basically lines up. There's plants between them as well. So was this common practice with couples?
Paired marital portraits in which husband and wife are shown as if pivoted slightly towards each other, or also known as marital diptychs, are very common in the Renaissance. But Holbein, as was his way, of course, elevates everything and takes it to the next level. So the attention to detail that you were just describing, where the curtain rails seem to line up, and you've got the vine leaves in the background echoing and mirroring one another in the two portraits, is not bog standard by any stretch of the imagination. That's something, very special that Holbein is doing. That's not something you see in every run-of-the-mill pair of Renaissance marital portraits. And the other thing that I would say that is unusual about Holbein's paired portraits of Sir Henry and Lady Guildford is, again, this way in which Sir Henry's portrait is very flexible. We know, I was able to discover in the documentary record, it's clear that Sir Henry, like Thomas More, ordered multiple copies, multiple versions of his portrait, in Sir Henry's case, seemingly in different sizes, from Holbein, no doubt to distribute to friends, family, fellow courtiers, fellow humanists. But it's a flexible image, so it could be displayed as part of a marital diptych, as we all are used to seeing it next to Lady Guildford's, but it equally could have been displayed as part of a humanist friendship diptych. And in fact, one of the most exciting documentary references that I came across was a hitherto overlooked inventory of Sir Henry Guildford's effects, which describes him having hanging on the walls at Leeds Castle in Kent 2 male friendship diptychs, which must have depicted him and Erasmus and perhaps More, and I don't know who else, maybe William Warham. But it, really, really exciting to see the flexibility of these templates that Holbein was designing. I think what's so exciting about Holbein, and again, this was something I hadn't realized until I started working on this book and really digging into the documentary sources, obviously a genius as an artist, but very shrewd and cunning as a businessman, thinking about new and innovative ways to market his product, to put it in very modern terms, and to kind of get maximum bang for buck, if you will.
So can you talk to me a bit about what you refer to as the types of portrait Holbein did? For example, you reference the thinking type. So what is this, and what are some of the other examples?
Exactly. So we talked a few minutes ago about Holbein's big break in 1523 when he is asked to portray Erasmus. And what he ended up doing for Erasmus was creating 2 portrait types, which, just for convenience, I in the book refer to as the thinking type and the writing type. There's no evidence that Holbein or Erasmus ever referred to them in that way, but it just seemed to make things a little bit easier for the reader to do that. So the thinking type shows Erasmus in 3/4 face, gazing contemplatively into the middle distance. The writing type shows Erasmus in profile at his desk, pen in hand, about to write something. And we have 1 surviving example of the thinking type and 2 surviving examples of the writing type, but it's very clear from documentary sources that Erasmus would have ordered multiple versions of each type from Holbein. Just obviously a lot of paintings from the 16th century do not survive for all sorts of reasons. And it's very interesting, it's Holbein and Erasmus are not the first to do this, but they are the first to do it on a large scale. And I speculate in the book that perhaps the fact that they were both embedded in the world of print culture, where the concept of multiple editions and reprints, etc., is, part of the nature of the beast, that perhaps that planted the seed of an idea that got them thinking about ways in which painted portraits could be not exactly mass produced, but made available to large numbers of people, but with slight tweaks so that each image feels personalized and bespoke to the recipient. So, for example, with the 2 surviving examples of the writing type, which, as I mentioned, shows Erasmus in profile at his writing desk, the backgrounds are different. So, there are all sorts of ways in which you could make an example of a set type or template seem unique for the recipient. And this would have been an easy way for Erasmus and others to curry favor with friends and would-be patrons all over Europe.
Another hugely famous portrait by Holbein is, of course, Thomas Cromwell's. Again, it's like Thomas More's, it's an instantly recognizable portrait. Based on what your findings and what you suggest in the book, it's quite heavy on symbolism, though. So the ring, the green cloth, the presence of a crown in the wall hangings. Walk me through that.
Absolutely. And this is actually another painting that we can think of as an example of a type. The surviving version that we all know is in the Frick, but again, it's clear from documentary evidence that Cromwell ordered multiple versions and copies of this from Holbein. It's just that most of them have not survived. Again, after Cromwell's fall, probably lots of people threw his portrait onto the fire to get rid of it. But this image, which I'm sure is familiar to many, many people, is not inscribed with a date, but we can basically narrow the window of time for its commissioning and execution to a very precise period in the spring of 1532 and early summer of 1532. In mid-April of 1532, Cromwell was appointed Master of the Jewel House, and this appointment is explicitly referenced in what is effectively the painting's inscription. Cromwell is shown seated at a table strewn with letters, and the topmost of these letters has a salutation addressing him as Master of the Jewel House. So this picture must have been commissioned by Cromwell to celebrate this appointment. And the fact that it makes no reference to any subsequent appointments of his, and they start coming thick and fast from July 1532 onwards, suggests that its commissioning and execution, I think, have to be between mid-April 1532, when he becomes Master of the Jewel House, and mid-July 1532. And everything in this picture seems to me designed to celebrate this appointment. So Cromwell is depicted wearing a large gold ring with a turquoise stone, and it's really almost luminous, the turquoise stone, and set off against the black cloak that Cromwell is wearing. And I think this is probably meant to be understood as a nod to the fact that he's the Master of the Jewel House now. The table at which he sits has a green cloth on it. I suspect a nod to the Board of the Green Cloth, which was a term used to describe the officers of the Crown who met to discuss the royal finances. Technically, the Master of the Jewel House wasn't a member of that group, but the Master of the Jewel House had a lot of control of the royal finances, because plate could always be melted down to make new coined money if finances were stretched. The wall hanging behind Cromwell is decorated with gold crowns, one of which is positioned directly over Cromwell's head, possibly a means of alluding to Cromwell's growing importance at court. The spring of 1532, when this was commissioned and executed, is, of course, the period when More falls, More resigns his offices, and Cromwell is the individual who derives the greatest immediate benefit from More's fall. And I think just as More, when he was at the height of his powers during Holbein's earlier visit to England, celebrates that by commissioning an image of himself from Holbein and then ordering lots and lots of copies for distribution at court, Cromwell is doing the same thing in 1532. And this all just happens to coincide with Holbein's return to England. He had been in England from 1526 to 1528, then he went back to Basel for a while, and then ends up coming back to England in the spring of 1532. Possibly hoping to pick up with More where he'd left off, but if that was his hope, that was not to be. But he lands on his feet and is very quickly Cromwell's man and doing all sorts of work for Cromwell.
So another obviously remarkable portrait that we have to discuss is the ambassadors. It's just incredible. But one of the most striking elements of the ambassadors is the skull on the floor of the painting. Can you talk to me a bit about this? Why is it included, and why was it painted in the unusual way it is, in that if you look at it side on, that's when it looks to scale rather than all stretched out when you look at it face forward? So what was going on here?
Exactly. Excellent questions. I don't have definitive answers for you, though. I'm not sure anyone ever will. As you rightly say, the anamorphic skull is this incredibly famous optical illusion. When you're looking at it straight on, it kind of just looks like a blurry blob in the foreground of the painting. And you have to stand in a very specific position off to the side to see it as it is meant to be seen, resolving into a skull. We don't know exactly why Holbein included it. There are an awful lot of theories. Certainly it fits in with what seems to be a larger memento mori theme. There are a lot of allusions to death and the transience of life in the painting as a whole. But precisely why the anamorphic skull was included, I think, will always just be pure speculation. I mean, I think one possible reason is that Holbein is showing off. I think this painting, he's throwing absolutely everything he has at it. And this is, just one more element of showing what he can do that not many other painters can do. And he signs this painting, which is unusual. Not many of his paintings are signed, and certainly not many of the paintings from this date, by which point he's reasonably well established. So again, the fact that it's signed suggests to me also he's sort of throwing down a marker, as it were, and
he wants people to know this is the Holbein.
Yeah, exactly.
And that skull, it does pinpoint his genius. I mean, it really is a remarkable achievement, and how he did it, I mean, it's astonishing, but that tells you beautifully just what an incredibly skilled artist this man was.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a complete showstopper, and anytime you wander through the National Gallery today, you've always got people in front of the ambassadors just looking amazed and delighted, and sort of walking from side to side in front of it, trying to find just that perfect vantage point to make the blurry blob resolve into a skull. So really extraordinary to think that almost 500 years on, it continues to stop people in their tracks. But I suspect actually that's what Holbein was going for. I was about to say he would be shocked, but actually I'm not sure he would. I think he would think, yes, that's exactly what I intended, and that's exactly what should be happening.
Yeah. So metalwork is another aspect of Holbein's career that is massively overlooked, including the fact that he made several pieces for Anne Boleyn. So what do we know of them? And I take it none survive, sadly.
You're right. None survive, or at least none that we know of yet. Who knows what might be lurking out there. But hundreds of Holbein's metalwork designs for both plate and jewelry do survive, mainly in the British Museum in London and in the Kunstmuseum in Basel. That's where the two great concentrations are. And so from the designs, you have to use your imagination. Obviously, these are two-dimensional designs, and trying to envision how a goldsmith might have realized these designs in 3 dimensions takes a bit of imagination. But in any case, we know that various pieces of jewelry that Holbein designed can be connected to Anne. Probably those were, well, actually, I suppose we don't really know. Some of those may have been commissioned by Anne herself. I suspect most of them were commissioned by Henry as gifts for Anne, as love tokens. But we have a splendid metalwork design for a table fountain by Holbein, which we know was commissioned by Anne as a gift to give to Henry for their first New Year's as a married couple. And that is really quite splendid, and must have been a huge talking point when unveiled amongst the 1534 New Year's gifts.
So there is also the Whitehall mural, which is one of Holbein's literally biggest pieces. Alas, the original was destroyed in a fire, but there is a copy. And there's also the original cartoon that we have of Henry VII and Henry VIII. So what was the symbolism behind this? And what were the changes that were clearly made, particularly around Henry VIII's face, I think?
Yes, absolutely. So perhaps just quickly worth saying that the mural was a dynastic wall painting painted for the Privy Chamber at Whitehall Palace. Work seems to have begun in the summer of 1536, so right after Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour. And Holbein probably completed the mural, I would have thought, by about the spring of 1537. So in other words, before Jane knew that she was pregnant with the future Edward VI. And we know what the mural looked like from this copy that you've mentioned, which fortunately was made shortly before the fire that destroyed the original. And so we know that the mural depicted Henry VIII and Henry VII on the viewer's left, Jane Seymour and Elizabeth of York on the viewer's right, all the figures life-sized, full-length and standing. In between the figures was a stone plinth inscribed with Latin verses which celebrated the Tudor dynasty. So the verses begin by celebrating Henry VII for uniting England, then go on to praise Henry VIII as an even greater king than his father. And the verses also have a go at justifying the executions of More, Fisher, and Anne Boleyn. And it must have just been extraordinary. An eyewitness account of the original mural describes the viewer feeling annihilated in the presence of Henry VIII. We know that Holbein took some liberties with the king's actual appearance and proportions. So he made Henry taller and leaner and more muscular than he actually was. But he also...
Which way Deborah's buttered.
Exactly. And you mentioned earlier that a cartoon survives. It's only a fragment. So it only shows Henry VIII and Henry VII. But interestingly, in the cartoon, which must date from sort of midway through the creative process, Henry VIII is looking to the side as if slightly pivoting or turning his head to look in the direction of Jane Seymour. But in the finished mural, he is staring straight ahead in that now iconic sort of hands, very on his hips, looking very feisty, sort of staring down the viewer. And so that's the sort of, annihilating Henry that has come down to posterity. And yes, absolutely fascinating. But I'm sure that was what Henry and indeed Holbein were going for, that absolute sense of annihilation.
And at what point does Holbein become officially the king's painter? And what was involved in this beyond the obvious and painting the king directly?
We don't know the exact date on which Holbein is officially appointed king's painter. He was definitely king's painter by the end of 1537, but there are gaps in the documentary records, which is to say missing privy purse accounts for a few years in the mid-1530s. So we don't know exactly what point Holbein gets put on the royal payroll as king's painter, which came with a regular salary from the crown. But presumably it was around the time that he got involved in the Whitehall mural, but whether it was at the outset of the commission or midway through or on completion of a job well done, we just don't know. And I think there's also some evidence to suggest, I discussed this in the book, that Holbein may have been appointed king's painter just temporarily for a brief period in 1535 in connection with a diplomatic mission to the continent, to Wittenberg. There does seem to have been a precedent for Henry creating painters, giving them the title of king's painter as a temporary honorific in connection with diplomatic missions. And this brings me to the second part of your question, what was involved in being king's painter? Yes, obviously painting the king himself, also painting other members of the royal family, and often being involved in quasi-diplomatic expeditions. So in Holbein's case, this really becomes prominent in the late 1530s when the search is on after Jane Seymour's death for a fourth queen. And the fact that he's a native German speaker is useful. The fact that he's a seasoned traveler is useful. And the fact that he is renowned for being a reliable portrayer of other people's likenesses also comes in handy. Lucas Hornbout was also someone who enjoyed the status of king's painter in the 1530s, but Hornbout mainly focused on miniature painting. Holbein, though he also did paint miniatures, seems more to have focused, certainly in his work for the king, on large-scale oil paintings. There seems to have been, at least within their respective realms as king's painters, Holbein and Hornbout seem to have sort of divided things up so that Hornbout was doing miniatures and manuscript illumination in the main for Henry, and Holbein focused more on oil paintings and other large-scale imagery.
And we must also, of course, mention Anne of Cleves, which is
Indeed.
what you alluded to a second ago there, because he is famously responsible for producing the images that are said to be what convinced Henry into the marriage. There is the more famous three-quarter length portrait of Anne, which obviously a couple of years ago had this cleaning process done on it, which blew everyone's minds. There's also a miniature. Do we know which one was presented to Henry?
We don't. So
Okay.
perhaps it's worth saying that the oil portrait, which is in the Louvre and which I used as the cover for my dust jacket, it's just such a gorgeous, gorgeous image now that it's been cleaned.
Yeah.
So
Who knew that was under there?
yeah, it was obviously looking a bit dirty before. And then there's also a miniature which is in the V&A, and they're very closely related. That Anne's facial expression and gaze, the full face pose is the same in both. Both show her against a blue background. The main difference is that in the Louvre painting, you've got her in three-quarter length on a very large scale, and the miniature is head and shoulders, and obviously fits in the palm of a hand. And we don't know for sure how these were deployed in the immediate aftermath of their creation. I mean, it may well be that they were both presented to Henry. Obviously, oil paintings and miniatures performed different functions. An oil painting would hang on the wall. A miniature could be carried in your pocket, could be worn as part of a piece of jewelry. A miniature was a more intimate, private, personal image. We just don't know is the answer.
There's also obviously a lot of talk that Holbein deliberately flatters Anne. What is your feelings here? Do you think that was actually true, or do you think that was more of a sort of a story spun by Henry?
I think it's very difficult to know if Holbein deliberately flattered Anne, given that, alas, we have no photos of Anne for comparative purposes. What I do think is that this idea that has grown up over the centuries that Holbein fell from favor after Henry met Anne in the flesh is just not supported by the
No.
evidence. Henry expresses anger and frustration with the written and oral accounts of his many ambassadors, but nowhere does he explicitly express anger or disappointment with Holbein's rendering of Anne's image. So I think this idea that Holbein suffers by association with his involvement in the marriage negotiations is a bit of a myth, actually. I mean,
Mm.
he retains his head, unlike Cromwell. He retains his status as king's painter. He retains his salary from the crown. He goes on in the early 1540s to create another portrait type for Henry, two new portrait types for the future Edward VI. I think he, basically just sails on pretty much unscathed by it all. He seems to have had a remarkable ability throughout his career to just bounce back from situations that I think a lot of people would have been thrown by, but he just seems to, keep going. And he must have been reasonably affable, I suspect, because he does, he was untarnished by his association with More, even after More fell, untarnished by his association with Anne Boleyn, untarnished by his association with Cromwell. And I think, too, Henry must have recognized that Holbein possessed a set of skills that no one else in England did, and that he was very useful and not easily replaced.
And I think there's often talk, isn't there, that, Anne of Cleves had a really big nose, and Holbein, the reason Holbein painted her facing forward was that he was able to disguise that. But there's also that, and you include it in your book, there's that portrait of her from before her time as queen, where she is facing sideways and she's wearing a black and orange striped gown. And you can clearly see from that this woman has not got a huge nose and isn't ugly or anything like that. So
Exactly. I think there may be a little bit of misogyny in some of the historic interpretations of these events, actually.
well, to conclude, Holbein appears to have died quite suddenly, as we sort of hinted, or you mentioned earlier, possibly of the plague. We don't know where he's buried. We don't know exactly when he died. But are we able to determine when his final sort of fully realised portrait was done?
Well, we know that he dies in either October or November 1543. We know he dictates his will on October 7th, 1543, and he's certainly dead by November 29th, 1543, because his friend Hans of Antwerp has to go to court to sort out various issues with the will that had been very hastily drafted and without proper legal advice. We don't know with certainty what the last completed work was. I think a lot of projects must have been put on hold from the midsummer of 1543 onwards, because the plague epidemic was so severe in London that basically all trade and commerce came to a halt. The king was sequestered away from pretty much everybody for fear of contagion. So I think for someone who made his living, or a significant portion of his living, from painting ad vivum portraits, an awful lot of projects must have come to a halt because, well, as we all experienced during the pandemic, there was not a lot of face-to-face contact between people during these months. But interestingly enough, Holbein's self-portrait, a preliminary drawing for which is extant in the Uffizi, which seems to have been a template for now lost portrait miniatures, though we have a sense of what those miniatures might have looked like. There's a mid-16th century copy in the Wallace collection. These are inscribed with dates of 1543, so I think it may be that the self-portrait was one of the last projects that he worked on, and that would kind of make sense. If you're effectively in lockdown and you can't get to where you need to go to work on your other commissions, it might
be
a way to pass the time. So certainly the self-portrait would have been, I think, one of the last projects he completed.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for coming back on the podcast.
So thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been a really interesting conversation. So what are you, now this is done, it's in the can, it's coming out in a couple of weeks' time. What's next? What are you working on next?
Oh, gosh. Well, in the short term, I am involved in an exhibition at the Philip Mould Gallery of Elizabethan Jacobean miniatures from the Bearsted collection. That opens on November 19th at the Mould Gallery in London and will run for a month. And I co-wrote the exhibition catalogue with Lawrence Hendra. So if people are in London and can get to that exhibition, it's a great opportunity to see some really special portrait miniatures from the late 16th and early 17th centuries.
Amazing. I will definitely be checking that out. That sounds brilliant. If people want to keep up to date with you, where are you across social media, website, etc.?
You can find me on Instagram, elizabeth.goldring, and you can find my webpage via the University of Warwick Centre for the Study of the Renaissance.
Well, thank you very much again for coming on the podcast. And no doubt when you discover another portrait alongside Emma in the future, you'll be back.
That would be lovely. Thank you so much, Adam.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Elizabeth Goldring for coming back onto the show to discuss Hans Holbein with me. Next week, I am very pleased to be welcoming back Helen Carster onto the podcast for a discussion all about the she-wolves of history, the likes of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, and Margaret of Anjou. That will drop next Thursday. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for being a listener to the Tudor Chess podcast, and chat to you next week.